We are live. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Haley Wooden. I'm a reporter at Business in Vancouver and co-host of BIV Today, our BIV Daily Business podcast. Now, today we have a very special episode. I'm joined by two guests who have generously donated their time to join me today to discuss and debate electoral reform, specifically, though, from an economic and business standpoint. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce my two guests today. I have seated right next to me Suzanne Anton. She's BC's former Attorney General and Minister of Justice. She's a director of the No BC Proportional Representation Society and has served as Minister for Public Safety, Emergency Management and Liquor Policy while representing Vancouver Fraserview as an MLA. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
I'm also joined by Maria Dobrinskaya. She is the spokesperson for Vote PRBC, the yes side in favor of proportional representation in our province. She's also the BC director of the Broadbent Institute and a regular media commentator on municipal and provincial politics. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
So I thought we could have a nice friendly discussion about electoral reform, as I mentioned, from a business perspective. I'm going to provide each of you an opportunity to allow some introductory remarks, and then I'll ask some questions, and then we'll get into a bit more of a debate-style discussion here today. So without further ado, Maria, I'd like to start with you. Why do you think the system you support, proportional representation, is the best for British Columbia, our economy, and for British Columbians?
Thank you. Well, 85% of OECD countries use some form of proportional representation, so it's the most commonly used electoral system amongst democracies in the world, and we see a variety of economic indicators in a number of pro-rep countries that are very positive. One of the key things I think that pro-rep does deliver that's very important to business, to a stable investment climate, is broad-based policy support, broad-based support for policy in a very stable investment climate. Basically, when you have coalition governments, when you have governments that need to develop policy by consensus, it sometimes takes longer, absolutely, but what they're able to do is provide, again, broad-based support, well-supported policies, which differs from what we see under first past the post, when you have governments come in of different ideological leanings and undo the work of the previous government in what's called policy lurch. And that can often throw businesses, throw investors off. We've seen a number of examples of that recently in Ontario and certainly even here in BC, looking at the pipeline and other situations.
Thank you very much for that. Now, Suzanne, why do you think the current system that we have in British Columbia is best for our economy and for British Columbians?
Well, I will say, first of all, I really fundamentally disagree with Maria's interpretation of where proportional representation would take us, but there's three main focuses that I have. One is the direct cost of government, the MLAs. Second is the cost of government overall as a portion of our gross domestic product. And third is the instability of countries that have proportional representation. All of those things are bad for business. And I can summarize it in three words: taxes, taxes, and taxes. Everything costs more money under proportional representation. So first of all, in terms of the direct cost of government in Victoria, the MLAs, if we were to go to mixed member proportional, which is the one the Premier is promoting, you get rid of some of the hard-working local MLAs who do hard-working local constituency work. They are non-partisan representatives of their constituencies, and particularly, in this case, the small businesses in their ridings, who they can come and see them and bring their issues and problems and difficulties. They don't care. That MLA doesn't care how you voted. You are their constituent. So you're going to ditch some of those, and you're going to replace them by people who are party representatives, because you have to feed people in, right, to achieve proportionality. What's the job of those proportional MLAs? They don't have a job. So you're going to be wasting all kinds of money on people that you don't need and have no discernible purpose. That's number one. Number two, under proportional representation, governments cost a lot more of public spending, way more public spending under proportional representation governments. Who pays that? Taxpayers, and people love turning to businesses for more taxes, and so that costs businesses a lot of money. And thirdly, is the instability. Proportional representation countries, all of them, have way more political parties and far more coalition governments. And for this, we have to look around the world. You can't just say, oh, in theory, everybody's going to work together. It'll be so nice. Because it doesn't work. You can look at Sweden right now. Sweden had an election on September 9th, more than 2 months ago. They've got a whole bunch of parties. They cannot agree, and it looks like they're going to have a new election. We don't need to bring that kind of instability in British Columbia. And I'll just give one example in BC right now that everybody is very familiar with, and that's LNG. Huge investment in British Columbia. If we didn't have a functioning government in place right now, that project could not go ahead. You need regulations built for the new, for new things like that. Permits get issued by staff, but you need a lot of ministerial support. You need regulatory support. You need a functioning government. If you're having somebody investing billions and billions of dollars in your province, they cannot do it if there's no functioning government. So in proportional representation, we're inviting a system where governments have a very tough time forming because they're coalition governments and they don't work. Look around the world and you will see every PR country, they're having difficulties. There is no reason to invite that into British Columbia. It will be very bad for business.
Now, Maria, did you want to counter?
I'll let you ask your next question. It'll come up.
Okay, yeah, I'm sure a lot of the things that we're talking about will come up throughout our discussion. But Suzanne, I'll stick with you and then go back to Maria. You mentioned perhaps some of the risks you see with proportional representation, but I'm curious to get your take on what the benefits are to small businesses of staying with the system we have.
We have a fundamental system of accountability right now. So your representative is accountable to you. Your government is accountable to you. If you don't like what the government is doing, you can get rid of them. I was elected as a BC Liberal. By the way, our society is a nonpartisan one, and my partner, Bill Thielman, is an NDP guy. So we're very nonpartisan. But I'll just use myself as an example. People got tired of the Liberals. That's a fundamental accountability. They wanted a new government. They got a new government. Premier Horgan is now his forming government. He too will face the voters in a couple of years' time. If people approve of what he does, he stays, and if they don't like it, out he goes. You lose that accountability under proportional representation, because if you have a coalition government, all this lovely consensual policy making, and actually the voters hate it, who's responsible? That is the worst part of proportional representation, is you lose that fundamental accountability which we have now. The individual accountability of MLAs and the collective accountability of government.
Maria, perhaps you can touch on that piece of accountability in your response to this, but the same question to you. What do you think the benefits are to small businesses of moving toward a proportional representation system?
Well, I actually think it'll be more responsive, and they're likely to have again, a policy that is longer lasting and more stable. I want to go to Suzanne's point, though, around looking around the world, because I actually think if you look at the data around the world and you look at academic research, 9 of the 10 of the top economic performers in the OECD right now with the highest GDP per capita use proportional representation. Average corporate tax rates in pro-rep countries in 2017 was lower than first past the post, 22.9% for pro-rep versus 27%. When we look at free trade in a study of 147 countries over 23 years, winner-take-all systems, first past the post, have higher tariffs than proportional systems. So again, looking at the economic performance of proportional representation systems, I think there's a lot of fear that's being built in that's not actually representative of what's going on throughout the world. In terms of responsiveness and accountability, I really have a different perspective around how accountable our MLAs are right now. This notion that we elect individuals who then go and represent all the constituents in the riding. I think from a service perspective, absolutely, MLAs do that. They provide constituents with service and are a conduit to accessing different aspects of government. But you can't vote two ways on one issue. So when you have an MLA in the legislature that is fundamentally bringing values that are fundamentally different from ones you hold, there is no mechanism outside of 4 years to have some say. One of the things that ProRep does do is it ensures that that all regions of the province will be represented in government, which I think is really important. So you'll have geographic representation, you'll have values-aligned representation. But depending on what business we're talking about, if we're looking at businesses in rural BC versus businesses in the Lower Mainland, they're going to have different ideas of what they need in their home communities. And I think ensuring that there are representatives from government from throughout the province is something that's really important for small business and for that accountability piece.
What do you think, Suzanne? Will it be more difficult, easier, more beneficial under which system for businesses to have a voice and industry leaders to have a voice?
There is no question that you need to have somebody in charge. That's the advantage of our majoritarian system that we have right now. You have a government, which was the BC Liberals before, it's the NDP now. People know who to go to when they need a direct government response. But the way to that government response, for small businesses in particular, is to go through their local MLA. Their local MLA will be advocating for them. Maria says we'll still have some. We will still have some, but we're going to get rid of a whole bunch of them, and we're going to replace them. We're going to replace them with party MLAs who have no, as I said, no discernible function, just a bunch of cost and they're just there to be their party representatives. I mean, you might as well just give their leader more votes rather than putting those extra bodies in place. But in terms of Maria's statistics, I just think they're so. Let's talk about British Columbia. Let's not talk about studies of multiple countries around the world. Let's talk about British Columbia. We are not solving an economic problem in British Columbia with proportional representation. We are causing problems, not solving them. BC is on surplus budgets now for 5 years in a row. Our economy is booming. We have almost no unemployment. We've got the best employment rate in the country. Everything is good in BC. There are of course issues for people, individual issues and collective issues. No question about that. But to have a good, well-functioning government helps you resolve those issues. That's what we have now. Let's not invite those problems from around the world, those problems of instability, problems of extremism, which I haven't even come to yet. Let's not invite those problems into British Columbia. There is no need. There's no economic problem that we're solving in British Columbia by proportional representation.
So I'm happy to hear you say that you don't want to look around the world, because that's something that your team regularly points to around the fear that we're supposed to have about proportional representation. But I think when we're talking about BC, which I'm happy to do because I agree it's important to look at what our situation is here, there are broad-based policies that are needed to actually drive economic growth, particularly in the city of Vancouver, that we have not seen, namely affordability and housing. And so the ability for businesses, and particularly tech startups and businesses that are growing, to secure employees in one of the most expensive cities in the world to live is a challenge. It's an obstacle to business. We've heard this from Hootsuite. We've heard this from a number of business owners. So I think that when you have, again, I believe that we should have stable, responsive government. What I'm arguing is that proportional representation, coalition majority governments under proportional representation would provide that in a way that we don't currently have now, and would ensure that there are, again, broad-based policies implemented that support the majority of British Columbians, that provide stability and investor confidence in a way that we don't currently have. Going back to the pipeline is a classic example of policy lurch. Now, whether you support it or don't, there's no question that the previous government's commitments to it, the current government's opposition to it, the change in position federally around the National Energy Board, these are all things that provide incredible amounts of confusion for investors. In Ontario, with Doug Ford's government, it's estimated to cost about $3 billion in policy lurch, and for him undoing a bunch of environmental initiatives around cap and trade in particular. Green energy investors ready to go, invested in that province a year ago, ready to go, were basically had the rug yanked out from under them when that government came in. That's not a climate that provides confidence to anybody.
Do you think a system of proportional representation can better enable government to tackle very controversial issues like the pipeline?
I think it better enables government to have hard conversations at the front end and to find consensus going in, so that what you get is less of the polarization, and that once you have government commitment to big projects, they're stable. They're less likely to face the uncertainty of a swing in government. One of the things that First Past the Post does is it enables a very small number of voters to have a very large impact on an electoral outcome. 200 people in Courtney Comox in the last election essentially determined the outcome. With proportional representation, a small change in votes does not yield a big change in the composition of government. So we have a more accurate reflection of where the electorate is at. You know, in Ontario, going back to Ontario, I think is a good example, going from the Davis government to the Ray government to the Harris government in less than a decade, representing a very dramatic ideological shift that was not representative of a dramatic shift in the electorate. The will of the electorate did not shift that dramatically, but what we saw in government was quite an extreme swing. And those swings would be lessened under proportional representation.
Suzanne, why would you argue then that we have the best system now in place to tackle, again, very polarizing, controversial issues?
So a couple of things. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that Maria said in there, most of which I fundamentally disagree with. First of all, listen to the undemocratic part of her message. Ontario was facing massive deficits, and they're counting the numbers right now, and I don't want to go too deep into Ontario politics, but there's a massive $14 billion, I think, if I'm reading it right, deficit. The voters were fed up with that. And they voted in a change of government.
40% of the voters.
They voted in a change of government. So I guess Maria would have liked to have had a coalition of NDP and Liberals in Ontario who would keep up that stuff that the voters hated.
No,
don't forget, right now we have, in British Columbia, I don't know how many they have in Ontario, but we have 87 separate elections. And it is the collective vote in those 87 elections that puts 87 people into Victoria that determines who forms government. So in Ontario, same thing. And the Ontario Progressive Conservatives got most of the votes. Do you not think that voters were entitled, as a matter of their democratic rights, to change government when they hated what the previous government was doing? And I think that that's what the PR people are arguing against. They have this. No, just hold on a second. You can have your chance in a moment. The PR people are saying, oh no, it'll all be sweetness and light, and government knows best, and don't worry. So you'll never worry. We'll always make perfect decisions, and you, the voters, will never be able to change our government. That is a very undemocratic message. On her first point. On the second point around looking around the world and those meta statistics that academics love proportional representation. And Jean Chrétien had a great quote for that. He says, academics love proportional representation because they want to get on those party lists so they never have to knock on doors and they never have to do the hard work that those of us who've been in the trenches in politics yes, and he has a great quote. Academics love it. So all those academic studies, let's look in practice. In practice, in British Columbia, things are very good. As I said a moment ago, we are not solving any problems by changing our form of government. And in practice, if you look around those OECD countries that Maria loves to talk about, you look at where they are all right now. They are all unstable governments. And they have very difficult time forming government. Sweden has a difficult time forming government. None of those things are good for taxpayers. They're not good for businesses, and they're not good for British Columbia.
Okay, thank you, Maria. I'd like to give you a chance to respond.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the distinctions, to be called undemocratic, I actually take offense to. I think the distinction around, I think voters absolutely should have their say. What I think, though, is that voters' say should be accurately reflected in the composition of the legislature. So and 40%, 37%, 38%, 40% of voters being able to determine what then becomes 100% of the legislative agenda, I do think is fundamentally unfair. I think we should have 50% or higher. We should have majority governments, and we should ensure that governments that are true majorities are enacting policies that are actually reflective of the will of the electorate. So I don't think that a government that's elected with less than 50% in a democratic system is actually enacting policy that's reflective of the will of the majority of the electorate, and that's the distinction I think that we're making is a majority, single party majority with less than 50% of the electorate support okay, These guys say yes. I don't agree with that. I think that the more people's voices need to be represented in the legislature than currently are.
So it's a fundamental disagreement in the form of government. To the proportional representation people, the only entity that matters is political parties. There's actually one province-wide vote for political parties that matters, and that determines the composition of the legislature. So by the way, if you live anywhere in rural BC and you're watching this, forget your few little votes in your town, because it's going to be dominated right here in the Lower Mainland. We will determine the composition of the legislature for the rest of the province. Absolutely. It's a province-wide vote that determines how many Liberals, how many NDP, how many New Party A, and how many New Party B, and how many Greens, and so on. That's the province-wide result. We are in a completely different system right now. We're in a system of 87 elections where 87 separate communities determine who their representative will be. And they look at that person for their community leadership. Quite often they're former mayors. Quite often they've run a store. They might have been the kids' soccer coach. And yes, they look at your political party. But all of those factors, to the PR people, there's only one factor that matters, and that's why they keep this mantra of 40% meaning this and 40% meaning that, because the only thing that matters to them is the vote that the political parties get. This was to my point earlier. We'll have some under mixed member, for example. We'll have some people directly elected. We'll get rid of a whole bunch of those directly elected, and we'll replace them with political party puppets who have no purpose except to be accountable to their parties.
Okay, so Maria, I'll give you a chance to respond to that, but I also want to throw in a question.
Sure.
I always have a long list of business-related questions, and that would be, Suzanne mentioned earlier the element of cost, and she argues that PR means taxes, taxes, taxes. You also threw out a dollar figure associated with the idea of policy lurch, so I'm hoping you can answer wrap somewhere into your answer, address the idea of how much PR might cost, or which political system ultimately costs taxpayers more.
Well, I mean, I think that really depends on what kind of governments you elect. Governments have different ideas about how much to tax, who to tax, and how to spend that money. And I think that varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But what we're guaranteed under proportional representation is that the decisions that government makes are reflective of the overall will of the electorate. And so I think that, again, you know, I can cite more statistics around lower corporate tax rates in pro-rep jurisdictions, more liberal free trade policies. So I don't think there is something particular to proportional representation that necessarily means higher taxes. I think that one of the things we do see, there's a number of Scandinavian countries that use proportional representation. Culturally, their approach to taxation is quite different than what ours might be here. And so sometimes those countries, I think, might skew some of the data around how much we tax based on an electoral system. I'm inclined to say our electoral system does actually not have much to do at all with how we tax. It's actually government decisions around, again, who to tax, how much to tax, and how to spend that money. But whether the government is making those decisions based on a narrow group of the electorate, or whether they're making those decisions amongst the majority of the electorate, is, I think, a very important distinction. But can I just speak to the 87 different elections and this notion of all of these independent MLA, we elect 87 different MLAs and they go to the legislature and all do their thing. In the last
members, they are party members.
Party members, and they're there to vote alongside their parties. In the last 8,500 votes in the legislature, 5 of them were offside with their party, were independent votes. We see federally when an MP, I mean, we see this provincially as well, but there's more instances of it federally. When an MP chooses to cross the floor, there's almost always an outcry from the public that MP should go back to the electorate. The reason being, the voters that voted for that MP voted for them because of the party that they were running for.
Only partially. No, that is an incorrect statement.
Not just because of who they are independently. With proportional representation, particularly with both MMP and RUP, we actually have the option of more voter choice. So what I would say in terms of being able to elect an independent or somebody in your community, somebody you know that's done good work in your community, maybe you really like them, but you don't like the party they run for or the leader of that party. Right now you don't have a choice, but your vote for that person is a vote for that party leader. Under proportional representation, you could split that vote. You could vote for that local candidate. You could also also vote for a different political party. And it provides you with more choice and a more range of options about how you're actually represented. I don't buy the notion that political parties don't have fundamental control over a political process right now. And you see that in the behavior of the MLAs in the legislature. Very, very few of them speak out against their leader, and those that do are often kicked out of caucus and pay the price electorally in other ways.
Did you want to respond?
I think if you want to see how first past the post works in terms of parties supporting their leader, go follow British politics right now, which is an interesting exercise in that. Look, people are elected for all kinds of different reasons, but it is the collective will of the voters that chooses the government. It's the collective will of those 87 elections that's chosen our government in British Columbia. You know, you can cite all these OECD statistics about taxes and so on. What matters is what's going on here in British Columbia right now. And in British Columbia, our economic situation is excellent. Now, the Premier, the NDP, has been putting some new taxes in. They will face the electors with those in a couple of years. And again, to this undemocratic message of the proportional representation people around what they call policy lurch and what I call voter choice, first of all, I think it's way overstated. And secondly, it's an undemocratic thing to say that voters shouldn't be able to choose a different course for their government. They've done that in Ontario, but when you even look at British Columbia as an example, the NDP railed against Site C. They railed against the LNG. I mean, it's always kind of funny when you see these things in the change of government. And yet, where are we? We still have Site C. We still have LNG. Those were major projects. There was a threatened policy lurch, and I agree it was a little bit rocky for a few weeks. But in fact, they are enthusiastically endorsing LNG right now, which is extremely beneficial to British Columbia. They've endorsed Site C, perhaps slightly reluctantly, but I would argue as well, Site C, clean energy, is also extremely good for British Columbia. So I think the policy lurch is overstated, and what it is really saying is we know best, voters. You don't get to change our policies when you change government, because we're going to be so clever in all our coalition governments. It is not turning out that way. You look around the world.
What it's really saying is that we actually think government should be making decisions based on the will of the majority of the electorate, not just the 37, 38, 39% of voters who elected a government.
Okay, we are almost out of time, so I figure what we can do now is provide an opportunity for some closing remarks, and I'll frame it in a business-related context. We'll start with Suzanne because Maria had the first introductory remark, and we'll end with Maria. Uncertainty is such a big topic, and it's a really important one to businesses, particularly in our current, you could argue, provincial, national, and global political climate. How does the system you support help address or eliminate uncertainty? And second to that, why should businesses vote in your favor during this referendum?
Well, taxes. If people love taxes, they should vote for proportional representation, because governments cost more. You get these MLAs that cost more, and then you get this instability of government. So that always costs people money. That inability to make decisions. Our first-past-the-post majoritarian system leads to very stable governments. We had a stable Liberal government. The NDP government was perhaps a little less stable because the vote was more even. But nonetheless, they have authority to make the decisions that they make. The voters, at the end of the election period, get to pass judgment on those decisions. That is the fundamental accountability built into our system. We are not solving a problem in British Columbia. Every government, be the NDP or BC Liberal, wants to help businesses, because we all understand how important it is for businesses to thrive. We're not helping businesses by bringing in a system to British Columbia which causes instability of government and raises taxes. That's not helping anybody. BC is one of the most stable, prosperous jurisdictions on the planet Earth. Low unemployment, high employment, good diversification of industry, strong businesses. Let's keep it that way. Let's not invite these foreign government systems into BC and these foreign problems. Look around the world, Sweden right now, hopeless. We don't need to bring that into British Columbia. Let's keep the stable and successful government that we have right now. Stick with the current system, our first-past-the-post system.
Thank you for that. Maria, twofold. Again, how can PR address the issue of uncertainty? And second, why should businesses consider proportional representation?
Thank you. Well, I think one of the sensitivities of a winner-take-all system is, as I mentioned, the ability for a very small change in voter preference to yield a very big change in government. And with that comes uncertainty and instability. PR systems are better equipped to deal with broad-based policy development that is longer lasting and that has a longer term focus. I fundamentally disagree with pro-rep means more taxes. There is nothing in any countries that indicate that.
Yes, there is. Lots of stats around that.
Well, you're very selective about wanting to look at other jurisdictions. But what I will say is it's clear in the regulations that the number of MLAs is not going to increase by more than 10%, if at all. It would depend on which system. So we may go up to 95 MLAs. But what the trade-off is in terms of if we are spending more on government is what we are not spending undoing the previous administration's initiatives. So longer-term commitment to broad-based policy outcomes. And yes, we have a very good economy here in BC, but there is a lot of things that are missing. There are a lot of, again, growing inequality. The affordability crisis in the Lower Mainland is alarming, and it's a problem for everybody, regardless of what side of the as a business owner or as an employee. And so I think the fact that these issues have gone as out of control as they are does point as well to the need for consensus-based politics that looks holistically at our entire provinces and assures that the interests of the majority of British Columbians are the ones that they're taking into consideration when implementing policy going forward.
Thank you. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have now, but Maria, Suzanne, thank you both for coming.
Thanks, Haley. Pleasure.
This.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Both of them and their colleagues are on the road over the next couple of weeks talking all about electoral
It's all about getting your
reform.
ballots in now. Get those ballots in the mail.
And anyone looking for any information about the referendum, your ballot, etc., you can go to elections.bc.ca. Thanks again for joining us.